Hello, my name is S.K. Williams, and normally I make 2 or 3 videos a week, which I make throughout the week, and then load them online on the TubeView and on Ramble, set to a schedule. Last week, while it was a video that was over 40 minutes long, I made one while ill with the flu, and I couldn't really produce that many videos, which is fine. I'm largely recovered from the flu, but it took me some days, and I didn't really have time to make that many videos. So I made 2. This one you're listening to now, and another. The other one is for the oncoming holiday of All Hallows Eve. But this one is the more general topic. And within 2 or 3 weeks, I think enough time will have passed that I shall be free to make a recording on a topic of some interest in mine, which I would like to discuss to some degree here as a preliminary. And I've made this point before in earlier videos, but I would like to make it again. Many left-wingers like to compare the times we're living in under President Donald Trump as having strong parallels with a historical cases in Germania in the early 20th century under Charlie Chaplin. Oh, and I should mention, since I am making this for the TubeView, and while I have been restored to the TubeView, I don't know how far my liberty extends on this platform, on this channel. I do intend on creating a new channel, but for now I will be speaking in the odd pauses, and I will also be doubling back on points, inserting them in awkward places to confuse the intelligent synthetica. Of course, doing so is also a bit jarring for human listeners. But I will be creating a new channel where I will attempt to speak normally, and even so, even when I create a new channel, I will be cautious on it at first. And I loathe being so cautious. I loathe not having liberty of word. But this is the world we live in, which is what makes it ironic that modern-day America under Donald Trump is being compared to Germania under Charlie Chaplin. And incidentally, for those who don't know, Charlie Chaplin was an actor who is famous for many roles, including The Tramp, his character that was in many shorts, but he also played in a movie called The Dictator, which is the movie that I'm referring to whenever I refer to Charlie Chaplin, because I can't use the actual name. But nevertheless, Charlie Chaplin in Germania was the leader of a political party, Socialists for Nationalism. This too is a euphemism. But I think most people will know what I'm talking about. People on the left compare modern America under Donald Trump to the rise of Charlie Chaplin and his Socialists for Nationalism. And they say that there are strong historical parallels. Of course, you can draw strong historical parallels with virtually anything if you are motivated to do so. But there really aren't strong historical parallels. And I will cover why that is so on my new channel once it is created and once I begin loading videos, and after a few innocuous videos to test the waters, as it were. But I prefer to compare... Oh, by the way, I will be loading this one video to Ramble as well as the Tube of You. I normally would like to make two videos, one for Ramble and one for the Tube of You, or at least to edit the video that I make for Ramble for the Tube of You and its censor on the ship. But regrettably, I can't actually do that. But having said all of that, America under Donald Trump and his presidency and his return to power really doesn't have the strong parallels to the Socialists for Nationalism rising in Germania under Charlie Chaplin. Even the things that the left are convinced of that make the parallels prescient, such as Donald Trump being a racist, aren't particularly valid. For one thing, I honestly don't think he is a racist. But even accepting that Donald Trump is indeed a racist, it is obvious that he really isn't trying to implement large-scale, sweeping eugenics reforms within the United States of America, which incidentally is what undergirded the Socialist for Nationalism platform. They were heavily rooted in eugenics. This fact, which is fairly well known, is largely ignored on online commentary and in public discourse, and even in academia they tend to acknowledge its central importance to the Socialist for Nationalist platform, but for whatever reason they tend to look to other factors for what caused it, and that is because the academic world is largely designed to promote left-wing thought these days, and specifically the left-wing thought as it emerged in the student movement of the early 20th century, in the 1960s, under the tutelage of Herbert Marcuse, who actually advocated that a universal tolerance for all ideas was bad, and what we actually needed was liberating tolerance. According to Marcuse, there is such a thing as regressive tolerance, and regressive tolerance is a tolerance for thoughts and ideas and speech that would actually undermine liberty and take away freedom and serve the oppressors, keeping people in an oppressive society, whilst liberating tolerance is barely ever spoken of, and when it is misunderstood. Liberating tolerance is not an effort to liberate tolerance, but rather is a type of tolerance that is liberating. And according to Marcuse, it is a counterweight against regressive tolerance. Marcuse understood liberating tolerance as a tolerance for ideas and beliefs and speech that liberates the people in society and does not perpetuate oppression. So, regressive tolerance, according to Marcuse, is tolerance of speech that leads to oppression. and liberating tolerance, according to Marcuse, is a tolerance that leads to liberation. And if you read his essay, which you can find online, Regressive Tolerance, you will swiftly learn that what Marcuse was talking about was not being tolerant of speech or movements on the right, but being tolerant of speech and movements on the left. And this isn't something I'm just saying or reading into his essay, like a right-winger who's finding demons everywhere, or a Christian who has their Christian persecution complex. It is explicitly stated in Regressive Tolerance that we should not be tolerant of movements from the right, but should be tolerant of movements from the left. This is explicitly stated. And considering that the progressive movement that we are seeing today largely just resurrected the new left and the ideas from the 1960s, which in turn simply revived the old progressive era's more radical and left-wing views from the 19th century, with whatever accoutrements that it had gained. It isn't hard to see how the modern left has embraced a Marxist power dynamic, and Herbert Marcuse was a Marxist, where you have oppressor and oppressed, and the oppressed are justified in doing anything or taking any action to liberate themselves from oppression. But this is where the idea of speech is violence comes from, and where the idea that modern students have that one should be able to shout out or stop right-wing speech on campus, or yell at conservatives, or silence conservatives, because in their minds, they're not taking away your liberty of word. In their minds, they are exercising liberating tolerance, where they are intolerant of fascism that oppresses people and are bringing about liberation. The fact that you aren't really being liberated because you are not free to disagree with them never dawns on them, because in their minds, they see liberation as tied with their ideologies. They are about freedom, whilst the right is about oppression. And this is where all of that came from. And of course, it's absurd. But without this idea, you would not have seen a sharp left turn in the early 2000s, and you wouldn't have even seen the rise of the new atheism. For example, Sam Harris argued that one of the values of a secular society is that secularism is tolerant, but religious creeds, no matter which religion it is, can never be tolerant. They are all exclusive, and they are all intolerant of other religions and people who have no religion. Religions are by definition intolerant and create the ultimate in-group, out-group dynamic. Even worse than race or nationalism or tribalism or other sorts of isms. Religion is the worst of all, for it gives everything cosmic import and says the creator of the universe himself is telling you to hate the other people who disagree with you. According to Sam Harris, religion is ultimately, by definition, intolerant and oppressive and takes away freedom. And that is why a secular society must dispense with the tolerance of religion, not just in the sense that we should practice separation of church and state, but we should have an aggressive secularism in society. We should not respect or tolerate religion itself, because religion is, by its definition, oppressive, and in order to preserve our liberty as secularists, we need to oppose religion. And Sam Harris's arguments were actually awful, but they were based entirely on the concepts that were drawn from the New Left and ultimately from Herbert Marcuse, a Marxist, which is ironic since Sam Harris also writes that we cannot blame any of the evils of communism on atheism, because the communists were not particularly rational, meaning that you can't be an atheist unless you're rational. And also pointing out that they actually functioned as a form of religion. In essence, Sam Harris is arguing that communism was a religion, and because it was a religion, of course it was oppressive, but it has nothing to do with atheism, which is the opposite of religion. And it's so much double talk, but it's very obvious that Sam Harris wants us to understand that modern secularists such as himself or Richard Dawkins or Daniel Dennett or the late Christopher Hitchens, they were totally different than the communists. They promoted having no religion, while the communists only said they wanted no religion, when in reality they wanted their religion to be seen as the one true religion. Communism is a form of religion. And the one thing we know that we must take from this is that modern secularists in America and Europe are nothing like communists and are not communists. And yet he drew his own ideas from communists, like Herbert Marcuse. I'm quite used to atheist duplicity, though, and dishonesty about their own past. Most modern atheists don't even know the history of atheism and atheistic thought. They continually insist that atheism is just a lack of belief in a God, and while atheism has existed historically, there is no history of atheist thought. It's just individuals who lack belief in a God. In reality, atheism is a belief that no gods exist. It is not a lack of belief in a God. Anthony Flew redefined atheism in the 1970s in The Presumption of Atheism as a lack of belief in a God, so that he could say the onus of proof is solely on the theist and not on the atheist. We now say burden of proof. And this is why people like Richard Dawkins say that the sole burden of proof is on the theist has no burden of proof, because the atheist is making no claims. And because the atheist makes no claims, the atheist can't have the burden of proof. But they are making claims. Richard Dawkins wrote a book called The God Delusion. You can't call God a delusion and call people delusional for believing in God without saying their beliefs are wrong. In order to be delusional, someone has to hold a false belief even after being shown evidence that their belief is indeed false. Delusional people reject the evidence they have been shown and persist in a false belief. That is what being delusional means. Calling God a delusion is saying that God does not exist, and we have evidence that proves it. Saying that people are delusional for believing in God means that you have shown them evidence that God does not exist, or at the very least they have been shown evidence that God does not exist, but persist in their false belief anyway. And yet Dawkins doesn't show the evidence that God doesn't exist. He merely waves his magical lack of belief wand, and all of a sudden, no one has to actually offer evidence that God does not exist who is an atheist. They merely lack belief. And it was always disingenuous. But it is also a tactic you see commonly used throughout the atheist community on more than just whether or not God exists. They always try and force the theist they're arguing with to accept the sole burden of proof. If the theist criticizes something the atheist says, the atheist will always try and turn it around, making the theist have to defend their position, define their terms. Theists, of course, are accused of never defining their terms. And these tactics are constantly used on the left in general. And that's one of the main points that I'm trying to get at, in a roundabout way. And I have to be roundabout thanks to the two of you. But this is what makes it very difficult to talk to a left-winger in general, because the atheist movement was all left-wing. They were all liberals. They were not conservatives. The idea that because atheism is just a lack of belief in a God, you have atheists all over the political spectrum, that's just rubbish. When you're talking to them, you're talking to a progressive.
And I know they're going to say I just said, all atheists are progressives, and then they'll try and point to someone who wasn't. And half the time they'll hilariously point to a Trotskyite communist and say he was a right-winger. That's what Hitchens was. He was a Trotskyite communist. He was not in any way really a conservative. But I'm really talking about militant atheists, so finding an atheist who's a Republican isn't really going to prove me wrong. However, I've spent years dealing with the atheist movement, and it's the same thing you see in the left. In fact, the modern left are people who grew up with the new atheism 25 years ago and are implementing their ideas. Even if they are doing so at a subconscious level, it shapes their view of the world. It shapes their view of what religion is and why we need separation of religion from state. It shapes their idea of how dangerous conservative views are and how they're tied to religion and how religion is irrational. It ties everything up in a neat little bow. So even the people on the left that say, I am religious instead of I am atheist, still have these ideas percolating, and they are ideas that percolate from the new left. And keep in mind, I'm one of those idiot religious people who thinks atheism is a religion and deserves mockery and insult. Of course, I also deserve derision because I often lie, because I clearly call atheism a religion, but then deny calling atheism a religion. Of course, in reality, I don't call atheism a religion. I call secular humanism and other philosophies that atheists gravitate toward that they claim are alternatives to religions. I never get that properly addressed by atheists, though. They always say that I just called atheism a religion and mock me for it, and when I clarify that my point is that it's not atheism that's a religion, it's secular humanism that's a religion, for example, I'm just ridiculed because I definitely called atheism a religion, and then now I'm lying about it, saying I didn't call atheism a religion. But that's the point. A lot of people on the left think that simply mocking ideas on the right dispels them and proves how silly they are. And they will often do so by misrepresenting what is being said and not addressing the real argument. And they will often employ, again, a tactic I'm used to from the atheist movement, a false view of history. And one of the most popular figures from history is Charlie Chaplin, the Chancellor of Germania in the early 20th century, who started the Dread War, the second great global conflagration. And therein lies the point, though. It is fairly obvious that the left is trying to draw parallels between the Socialists for Nationalism Germania under Charlie Chaplin and the modern day. And they've been doing this for a long time. This didn't really begin with Donald Trump. In reality, they did the same thing with George W. Bush. And I'm fairly certain that many of the more left-wing outlets were saying the same thing about Ronald Reagan. But you certainly get a sense that is amplified since the time of Reagan. Bush was routinely referred to as having strong parallels to Charlie Chaplin, and America being very close to Weimar Germania. With Bush called a factist, and the other conservatives called factists. They did so with less frequency than today, but it was rather common to see. You can see books written a long time ago against Bush that would make these sorts of statements. I would love to list the titles, but I'm afraid that such action would be used against me, so I shall do so in a future video on another platform, and perhaps on this platform on another channel later. But
Ever since Donald Trump's first term in office, and recall he is serving his second term, which is non-consecutive. But ever since Trump's first term began, the amount of times and frequency of the allegation of fact-ism have gone up, and calling Trump and all of his supporters socialists for nationalism have gone extraordinarily high. But adding to this mix, they've also started doing something that the Tea Party did when Barack Obama came in that I find rather interesting, so much so that I wish that in this video I could be more plain about it rather than roundabout, and not having to use stutters and delays and certain other tactics. But they've started calling Donald Trump a king, and they've had the No Kings protests, and they talk about how back in 1776 we got rid of kings, and we don't want another king, and Trump is ripping up the Constitution, making himself a king. And all of this is rather silly, of course, but it ties into the American mythos and gives legitimacy to their cause. And ironically, America doesn't really have much in common with Germania in the 1930s and the rise of the socialists for nationalism. But the left is right about the parallels between the American Revolution and the modern situation. This is not because Donald Trump has actually ripped up the Constitution and declared himself a king. And I really hate drawing this analogy, not because I don't think it is true, I do, and not because I am loath to make it out of some sense of patriotism, I'm not, but because I know that anyone who is conservative who listens to this, even knowing that I am operating under heavy constraints from the two of you, precisely because they saw me as too conservative, for reasons that still baffle me, because my channel wasn't all that political until recently, and the only reason it's become political is because of Al Gore and his rhythm, and because of how I'm being treated, and because of the censor on the ship that I am receiving. Prior to that, I was not a deeply political person, and I wasn't deeply motivated by politics. I am now simply to restore my own liberties because the left has gone too far. But therein lies the point. I am a conservative. In reality, I'm something that conservatives often accuse, that people on the left will often accuse people on the right of being, which is used as an insult by them, and which makes me sound all the more fake when I protest being called progressive or liberal myself. I am a reactionary. And the reason I say that isn't because I think conservatives call themselves that because we leftists do. It's because I actually am one. You see, I am a monarchist living in the United States of America. I am from Tennessee. I was born on the 4th of July, literally. I should be waving the red, white, and blue flag and talking about the greatness of the Founding Fathers, especially being from the South, the conservative South with the Bible Belt. So I should have a Bible in one hand and an American flag in another, praising America. And if I'm not, it must be that I'm progressive who rejects both America and the Bible. Indeed, the right has its own myths about this, one of which I've spoken of recently and would like to cover again in greater detail, perhaps in 2 or 3 weeks as I write the scripting for the video. It will be more complex, and unlike most of my videos, will need scripting. And I will, of course, load it on Ramble with a highly edited version for the two of you, and perhaps a less edited but still edited version for a new channel if I create it within that time. Or perhaps I'll just load it later. But I'm one of these paradoxes. Because people generally think in stereotypes, and while most people know that stereotypes aren't entirely accurate, they still think in the broad general sense of a stereotype, and most of the time you're actually right about them. Normally, if you see someone who rejects America and doesn't like the American flag, they are progressive, and I reject those things, so I must be a progressive. And of course, progressives are largely atheists and secularists who reject religion as a great evil. This isn't quite as clear-cut, because there are some people who are religious on the left, and I hate talking this way, because I think everyone on the left is religious, including atheists. Not because I think a mere lack of belief in a God is a religion, but because their narrative of progressivism comes out of their humanist tradition, and humanism is a religion. It's not a non-religious life stance, it's a religion, and their atheism is not a lack of belief in a God either. But talking in the parlance of today, which separates secularism from religion, and muddies the waters in my view, but I've discussed that before. We have the secular left and the religious right. There are people, of course, on the left that call themselves religious instead, but they still accept that religion is a private matter for the home and in the church, and doesn't belong in politics or the public square. They still are accepted in progressive circles because they are largely secularists when it comes to the public. And I would also like to point out that most people like that, whilst claiming they have a faith that is in their home and in their church, that is different than their secular values they hold to in the real world, because, well, golly gee goshums, we don't want to be like Iran and Saudi Arabia, tend also to hold those progressive views in their home and in their church. They tend to go to progressive churches, or if they don't, if they go to something like the Catholic Church, tend to hold progressive views whilst at church. So really their progressivism is more their religion than their Catholicism. Their progressivism is more their religion than their Christianity. Their Christianity is subordinated to it. But that is neither here nor there. You see, in our cultural mindset, we have this idea that if you are a traditionalist, if you are a conservative, if you're in no way progressive, and you are a Christian, then you're going to point to America's founding fathers being Christian and creating a Christian republic on Christian principles, and how when America was created, there were no other republics. Everything was ruled by kings who claimed, of course falsely, that they ruled by divine right and no one was allowed to question them, and there was no separation of powers. And America's founders rejected not only the tyranny of one king, King George III, the monster, but rejected the tyranny of kings altogether. But to make certain we didn't have tyranny, they decided to divide powers. So for the first time in history, a country had divisions of powers and separation of powers and checks and balances. No other country had that. Everywhere else had a king deciding everything, but America was different. It was a country of the people. And many on the right would even point to the fact that they were inspired by the Bible to invent the three branches of government. There's a verse in Isaiah that says that God is our lawgiver, God is our judge, God is our king. And they read that verse, and from there they realized the government must have three branches, and they invented the three branches of government. Of course, all that is silly. The idea of having three branches of government was not invented by America's founding fathers based upon a chapter and verse from Isaiah. Rather, Britain had three branches of government for centuries before the American Revolution even took place. And a lot of America's legal tradition comes from the British tradition, or specifically the English tradition from before the Act of Union. A lot of the parliamentary procedures were inherited from there as well. There are differences, of course, but the idea that the three branches of government were invented by America's founding fathers is absurd, even though it's something that a lot of Americans believe. And it is equally absurd to think that they were inspired by a verse in Isaiah when they very clearly were not. If anyone was inspired by that verse, it would have been the first parliamentarians in Britain to come up with the idea of a separation of powers, because that's where it actually comes from. Britain is, after all, known as the mother of parliaments, even though today's Britain has fallen far short of that. Ironically, they will blame being a monarchy for that, when the monarch doesn't really have power to change it, and they praise themselves for being a democracy who don't even give the House of Lords a right to stop the decisions of the House of Commons, because democracy.
But therein lies the point. I do not hold to the idea that religion is toxic and poisonous and must be abolished. I hold to the idea that those who say that are themselves imposing a form of religion whilst denying it, even to themselves. And I myself hold a very traditional, very conservative Christian view in modern parlance. And I hate talking this way because it's not accurate, but I don't think the audience will understand it until I'm able to speak more clearly and explain more about what I mean. But I hold a very traditional faith. I grew up in the Churches of Christ. And while I don't really consider myself a part of the Churches of Christ any longer, I do have an admiration for the fact that the Churches of Christ are committed to a deep intellectual study of the Bible and discourage your emotions leading you. Of course, the Churches of Christ are themselves misunderstood. I often hear from people that because they are congregational in nature, there's a great deal of disagreement in Churches of Christ, and if you go to one congregation, it'll teach something totally different than another, and that's the problem of congregationalism. And this isn't really true. It's just assumed that because the Churches of Christ have no central headquarters organizing them, that there must be radical disagreement within the Churches of Christ. There's not. The Churches of Christ have a very uniform belief system. Having been to several congregations in my life, I know that if I go to a congregation in Tennessee, it will teach the same things as one in Louisiana, it will teach the same thing as one in California, it will teach the same things as one in England. And they're able to stay uniform in their beliefs by a shared literary tradition. They read the same circulars and pamphlets and tracts and such. They're not as decentralized in their thinking as people think they must be because they are Congregationalists. But nevertheless, the Churches of Christ are a very conservative group, regrettably referred to as evangelical Protestant in the Encyclopedia Britannica. They're not. They actually came out of the Restoration movement, and they don't believe in that specific moment when you get saved. And by that, I don't just mean they don't think you get saved at the moment you pray and invite Jesus in your heart. They move the salvation to baptism. It's another common misconception about the Churches of Christ. They don't think you get saved at baptism. You don't really hear people in the Churches of Christ talking about getting saved. Salvation is a process that you go through rather than a single moment, which is why it's not evangelical. And the reason it's not Protestant is because even though they do hold to the Protestant belief that the Scriptures are the sole source of authority in matters of faith and practice, they do not believe that we are saved by faith alone, which means they can't be Protestant. Nevertheless, they are very conservative, they are very rigorous, and they don't want you to believe things based on emotion and emotional experiences. Another reason they can't be evangelical or Pentecostal. And they're cessationists. They believe that miracles ceased after the death of the apostles and the end of the apostolic age. The apostles had the ability to pass on the ability to work certain miracles to people, but once the last person whom the apostles gave that gift to died, no more miracles would happen. We wouldn't need it. We had the Bible. And after a while, as I grew older and became an adult and such, I drifted away from the Churches of Christ, but not in the normal fashion that people think. I didn't drift into liberalism and go to wild parties and start doing the drug, sex, and rock and roll thing. Rather, I drifted more and more and more into traditionalism and history, which is what gives me a great appreciation for the Churches of Christ, perhaps greater even than when I was part of them, because they get so much right. I just think certain things are off because of what I have learned about historical Christianity. So I get along better with traditional Catholics or traditional or Eastern Orthodox, or even the Churches of Christ that I grew up in, than I would from a liberal church with a woman pastor who dyes her hair blue and has a partner who is also a woman. In fact, I loathe calling people we're married to partners, or one's girlfriend your partner. That sounds rather cold and impersonal. But we do. especially on the left. And therein lies the point. I'm not left-wing. And I am very Christian. My entire identity rests upon my Christian faith. Though contrary to the way atheists put it, this isn't because it's my emotional crutch, and the idea that I absolutely refuse to question my faith and use reason. No, I have used reason. I have questioned my faith. I have heard all the atheist arguments. And I am perfectly willing to throw away Christianity if I don't believe it is true. Even though so much of me is rooted in it, I am willing to throw myself away in the pursuit of truth. But no one has ever convinced me that Christianity is false. And I don't have to justify why I think all religions are false and fairy tales and think they're delusional for believing in them. Because I don't think people are delusional for believing in religions other than my own. I don't focus purely on the fact that there are disagreements. I think there's considerable overlap as well. I think they're often talking about the same things. I just think that certain things they believe are imperfect. And I'm perfectly willing to discuss those specific fine points, while at the same time acknowledging commonality of belief in other ways. The simple truth of the matter is, I don't think like the progressives say I do, and I am not a progressive. But that's the whole problem. You see, being a monarchist in itself goes against the American identity. America was founded by rebels who got rid of the tyranny of kings. Why would I want to live under the tyranny of kings? Well, this video is already getting too long, so I shan't discuss too much my views. But I will say this. Just because one lives in a monarchy does not mean one lives in a tyranny. Monarchy is not, by definition, tyranny. And the usual argument I get is, well, even if you have a good king that grants liberty, what if you get a bad king who doesn't? And the assumption people make about kings is that they rule by absolute divine right, and there's no separation of powers. You can have separation of powers in a monarchy. You can even have a monarchy where if the king abuses his power, he can be removed from the throne, all without violent revolution and without declaring a republic. You can simply remove the king and put someone else in as king. This has actually happened historically. This is, for instance, how the Orange dynasty was supplanted in England because they were German Protestants, and the monarch, James II, became Catholic. So the idea that you can't get rid of a king shy of violent revolution isn't really true. Granted, the example I chose may not have been the best to show that, but you could put in law that a king must abdicate if certain things happen or can be forced out. It would be no different than an impeachment law for a president. But having said all of that, we should get to the real point. I agree with the progressive protesters when they draw parallels between modern America and the America at the Revolution. But I do so not because I agree that Donald Trump has ripped up the Constitution and made himself a king and thus a tyrant. I don't even think Donald Trump has ripped up the Constitution and made himself a king, and that's a good thing. Donald Trump is not a king. He is a duly elected president. But they're only using the term king because Americans associate kings with tyrants, and because America bows to no kings. I even remember a commercial which I think was for beer that had that, "We bow to no kings." And the simple fact of the matter is that by calling Donald Trump a king, they are evoking something deep in the American consciousness that causes them to reject Donald Trump, that causes them to see him as evil. And it's the same reason they call him a fact-yest, and why they call him a socialist for nationalism, and why they draw comparisons between him and Charlie Chaplin from the movie The Dictator. But of the two, America is nothing like Germania. America did not lose a major world conflagration, was not occupied by foreign powers, and did not have a constitution and a new government foisted on them by outsiders, at least not in the same way via military conquest. And while America's economy wasn't great under Joe Biden, the left would say it was, and it was getting better, and that Trump is the actual cause for its decline, the actual economy isn't running away as bad as it did in Germania. Even as bad as it got under Joe Biden, it wasn't that bad. And Americans did not have this damaged sense of being a conquered people. Americans still have a sense of American pride and greatness that has not been offended. Granted, many people on the left, ironically, are trying to cause that situation, but even people on the left have a hard time overcoming their own sense of pride, which is why they will often, on the one hand, down America's history and the systematic racism using critical theory, and on the other hand talk about how we have no kings and we need to be like America's founding fathers and how wonderful that is. And I don't think conservatives quite understand that point about the progressives. The entire view that progressives have is that history, at least ideally, unfolds on an arc leading us to greater and greater progress, with greater and greater rights and freedoms being granted us as we advance in cultural and social knowledge and improvement. So, while for a conservative criticizing America's founding fathers is awful, and you would think that this must mean that the people who are criticizing America's founding fathers do so out of a sheer hatred of America. The progressives are critical of America's founding fathers, but still see them as a marked improvement of what came before. They see them as a part of an evolutionary process who were good for their time, but still had major faults that needed to be overcome, because they have a very evolutionary sense of social progress that largely stems from social Darwinism. But therein lies the point. They have their own myths and their narratives that justify their perspective, just as the conservatives do. But in a twist of history, they have become more aligned with the behavior of America's founding fathers and the founding generation of rebels that gave us the United States of America than the conservatives, who hold America's founding fathers up as indelible heroes who are inscrutable and are due all honor and glory and fame, and who are our shining lights and our examples. And the reason for that is because in the real history, America's founding fathers were not heroes. They used many of the same tactics that the modern left does, and were even willing to engage in violent riots and violent criminal acts to get what they want. For example, we will talk about how absurd it is that the media talks about fiery but mostly peaceful protests, or how a situation could become volatile if you send law enforcement in, since it's just a bunch of people having fun watching cars burn. And if you bring law enforcement in, it could escalate to actual violence. We see those things as conservatives and know how patently absurd it is. And we know that talking about the Trump administration being fat-yesed by denying due process to migrants and being against immigrants is unjust, since the way they state it, it sounds like he's going after immigrants in general and not just those who entered illegally. In fact, many of them will explicitly state that. They'll say, he's claiming he's going after illegals, but he's really going after all immigrants. And there's no reason to think that, but they do promote that narrative, that Donald Trump is a racist and that he hates black and brown people, and that's why he hates the immigrants. And they look at Trump sending in the National Guard to various cities in America, largely controlled by Democrats. Even the ones in red states are controlled by Democrats. And they say that this is the act of a tyrant who is using the force of the American military on American citizens. A tyrant using the military to enforce his rule. This is not America, not the America we love. This is tyranny under King Donald Trump. It's no different than the tyranny of King George III. And they're right, it's not. Granted, immigration wasn't the primary focus. But one of the things that eyed the colonists was the king sending troops and quartering troops in America. How is that any different than what Donald Trump is doing, really? I know that in some ways it's different because they were quartering them in people's private homes, but so what? America allowed that to happen as well after the Revolution. And really, even when the soldiers were not quartered in people's homes, even when they had barracks, people were objecting to it. Look at the Boston Massacre, for example. Am I honestly supposed to think that the rebels who wanted freedom were being wronged by the presence of the soldiers? Boston had become a lawless hotbed of sedition. They had attacked government officials. The army was sent to Boston precisely to quell violence. And this led inevitably to the Boston Massacre, which was a great act of tyranny where the regulars, because America did not think of itself as different than British at the time, the regulars shot at innocent colonial citizens, innocent subjects of the crown. But if you look at the history, those innocent subjects of the crown were pelting the soldiers with snowballs, with rocks embedded in them or glass, and jeering at them. A mob situation was quickly escalating, and a young, inexperienced soldier fired a shot, and then others defending him, falling in line, did so too. Yes, people were killed, and it was tragic, but it was hardly the fault of the regulars. And even John Adams, who defended the one who shot the first shot, made that case. And look at other events from the American Revolution that we lionize as heroic, such as the Boston Tea Party, when a lot of businessmen from Boston disguised themselves as Indians and boarded a ship and destroyed the tea. This is romanticized in America as an act of defiance against tyranny in the name of liberty. But really it was a group of criminal smugglers destroying someone else's property solely so that it could not be sold cheaper than their tea that they were illegally smuggling in to avoid duties and taxes. The simple reality is America's founding generation were terrorists. who engaged in an act of insurrection for their own personal benefit. I know that saying that is unpopular, but it is nevertheless true. Look at the Gillespie affair. This has been immortalized in the Declaration of Independence, the bit where it talks about sending people away to trial far away from the jurisdiction where the alleged crime took place. This is a reference to the Gillespie affair, where a naval ship was lured into the coastline and beached, and people who didn't even wear masks, whose identities were known, boarded the ship and burned it down. The crew members of the Gillespie knew who it was who did this to their ship, and petitioned to the local law to arrest them, and the local law refused. They petitioned to the colonial government, and they refused. So it was decided that because the attack was on a naval vessel, they will try it under naval law in naval courts, and they arrested the people sitting in the Navy to do so. This wasn't an act of tyranny. They tried going through the civil courts, and the civil courts were run by insurrectionists. How is that any different than modern liberal judges running things and turning down Trump's requests? The simple truth of the matter is, the modern left likes talking about the right as insurrections and talking about January 6th. But they are the ones engaged in actual insurrection, which ironically places them in the same position as America's founding fathers. And should we escalate to a civil war, which is what we will call it, we will not call it a revolution, although, well, perhaps we will. But the American Revolution was a civil war. It wasn't the Americans versus the British. Americans were British. They were British colonies. And it doesn't really matter what modern Britain is like. Modern Britain is a product of the American Revolution having been a historical fact, and the ideas that came from America and that spread through the Enlightenment. 18th century Britain was nothing like modern Britain. And you can't blame those two. But nevertheless, there are a lot of parallels. And should the left manage to foment a revolution and fight a civil war in America and win, either by separating some states from others, having 2 or 3 new countries where one used to be, shattering the United States of America, creating the divided states of America, if you will, or if they manage to outright take the government of the United States of America and sweep away any conservative government, implementing new laws, new constitutional amendments, or perhaps a new constitution altogether, enshrining progressivism and progressive ideals, then what you will learn in school after that glorious revolution will be the same left-wing propaganda that we see today, that we are largely rejecting. And it will go as unquestioned fact. And 100 years later, it could be just the truth that most people think of. Just like it's the truth that King George III was a sole ruler, an absolute monarch who thought he ruled by divine right and was a tyrant. And that the 3 branches of government were invented by America's founding fathers, based upon Isaiah, just like it's understood that the king was a tyrant and America's founders did the right thing to overthrow him. The simple truth of the matter is, we know that America's founding fathers were heroes who did the right thing, because we read their own words of the account, but do not look at the opposite side. We only look at their side, and we never question them. Even if we were to look at the other side, we would always look at the other side in a more critical view, saying, of course, that's true, whilst with America's founders, accepting what they say uncritically. The simple truth of the matter is, we know America's founding fathers were heroes for emotional reasons and for reasons of identity, not for reasons of history and fact. And America's founding fathers are largely exempted from criticism. And the same would happen if the progressives won and took over America through a revolutionary process. we would learn in school that Donald Trump was a tyrant and a racist and a socialist for nationalism, and we would know that he was a monster. We would know that he had ripped up the Constitution and made himself a king. We would be reading left-wing propaganda as historical fact. And many people would believe it. Even if society had become more conservative, they would simply reinterpret the slogans and catchphrases and arguments in light of their new conservative beliefs, much like we do today. But America's founding fathers weren't really the conservative Christian force that they are said to be. They weren't really the atheists and deists the left say they were either. But they weren't really the heroes that should go unquestioned. And that is a topic I would like to discuss again, in a video that doesn't have to take about half an hour to get to the point, and that doesn't have to use quite so many so that I can simply talk like a normal person. But this is the world we live in, so I wanted to make a video for the two of you, and I have. And now I haven't much else to say, so I shall take my leave of you. But thank you, God bless, and goodbye.